just like the STEM 7.4 results program, the new interface will allow you both to draw a new graph, meaning you pick the results from the full list of results that are available, or you can do a draw, which means you're basically picking from a list of predefined graphs which gathers together some of the most useful results and some of the most useful result combinations, just to save a little bit of time for the most common tasks. So when you select graph draw as opposed to draw new, then what you'll see is that we have the same interface for selecting the elements and all the other bits and the scenarios and the format and whatever, but where we had the results tab, here we now have a graphs tab. So let's just go through this and pretend we're doing something. So I'm going to select a couple of elements. We'll pick DSL access, which is a service, and DSL shelf, which is a resource. And if I then go across onto the graphs tab, you'll see that what this does is it lists some graphs that are available for the selected elements. So the idea is here that is what it's doing is it's showing you only the graphs which make sense for the elements you've drawn, so the elements that you've selected, and then you can pick them as you would with the results. So the thing is that one of the original motivations for changing how this all works was that the list of graphs in the 7.4 results program was a very long list, because all the graphs were differentiated by type. So you'd have network operating charge, and you'd have service operating charge and resource operating charge, and that was with good reason, because ultimately the results are linked to particular types of data. But from the perspective of saying what do you want to draw, conceptually you're just saying I want to draw operating charge. So what you see here is just the, if you like, the canonical names, and that means it's a much shorter list, because rather than having 5 different versions of each chart, you simply have the one. And as I say, it just makes it easy to work with. And so the set you get here will be only for the ones that you've selected. Can't think of anything else to say at the moment. So as I say, these names are mostly not specific to type. So where it says, for example, depreciation and amortization here, that could be for a service, it could be for a resource. If you go and look for operating charge, here it is, then you can draw operating charge for both the service and the resource. And if I do nothing else and go through to the end and do OK, then I'll get operating charge with the service and the resource, and of course they're on the same graph because I didn't ask them not to be when I selected the elements. So it actually makes it very easy to draw a graph combining various things, and if you like, that's the simplest mode of operation. And now I just need to show you a few more details to do with how this works. So if we just go back and go through that again, so we go graph and draw. So again, I've selected these two elements, and then I'm going to go across to the graphs tab, and what you'll notice is that unlike each of the other tabs, there is no explicit selection list, and that's because when you select a graph, you're already picking a selection of results. So operating charge is only one result, but if I was to go and pick something like installed and incremental units, which should appear just like that, but I think at the moment it appears with resource at the front, it should just say installed and incremental units. If I say I want to draw that, then it's implicitly selecting installed and incremental units in a particular order. So on this tab alone, we don't have the separate selection box because it has no purpose. That box exists to say what is going to go on one graph and in what order, and you have to imagine that all of that's essentially wrapped up in this single selection here. Similarly, there is no separate graphs box here because, again, it would be meaningless to draw a graph on separate graphs. So when you pick resource installed and incremental units, implicitly you're saying I want to have installed and incremental units on the same graph. Whether or not the elements go on the same graph is not to do with this tab. That's governed by the separate graph setting in the elements tab. But in the graphs tab, if you say resource installed incremental units, by definition it is a single graph, and there is no concept of putting those results on separate graphs. Just like in the results, the original results tab, we have various filters. So if you want to get things like operating results, you can type operating in here, and you'll just see the operating type result, operating type graphs here. You also have all these filters, so if you only wanted to see the essential one, I could do this and you'd see the very basics. Actually, I don't believe that's the only essential one, but that's mainly because we haven't finished doing the characterization yet. So similar functionality. These settings will be independent of the one for results, because it might well be the case that you'd want maybe the essential and standard graphs, but maybe only the essential results. It really depends on how it works out. So they will be independent, those settings. And similarly, the recent here relates to recent graphs you've selected, and favorites relates to favorite graphs as opposed to favorite results, and you'll be selecting favorites, adding to favorites here. So those two mechanisms are completely separate and in parallel. The other thing to point out is that because the list of graphs, which is already reduced almost fivefold by only having the canonical graph name once rather than 5 times over for each of the different types, the setting down here where you can choose the only available for some types, which is probably going to be rebadged as type specific graphs or type specific results, whereas for results it's off by default, which means you'll only see the results which apply to everything. We did it that way because there were just so many results, and it was all made to keep it manageable, and also to avoid silly combinations on a single graph. Whereas because this is a list of graphs, there isn't the same issue about combining silly things on a graph, because each selection, each item in the available list is already a graph in its own right. And because a very common thing you want to do is to draw several graphs in one go, and in the training course you're asked at a very early stage, you're asked to do something like service demand and connections and resource installed in incremental units. We felt that in the graphs context it was better for this to be checked by default, so you would see graphs for things that, you'd see graphs that were only available for some of the elements you'd selected. And so as an example, if I had selected, as I have selected my service and my resource, with it working like this, it means I can straight away go in here and say, actually I'd like to see demanding connections, and I'd like to see installed in incremental units, and say OK, and it should mean that straight away it'll draw, and of course unfortunately I had already drawn those results, but anyway, it means straight away you'll be able to see demanding connections for the service, and you would be able to see installed incremental units for the resource if the interface was working properly. And unfortunately right now it will only work with one graph, but Stuart promises me that very soon it will be able to do multiple graphs, obviously, which is how it's intended to work. So that's why we show even type specific results, type specific graphs, whereas by default, whereas we don't show type specific results by default. Okay, so that's it really. That's most of the important information. Just a few details. So you may recall that a few of the predefined graphs are actually intended to be tables. So for example, if I go graph draw, and I'm going to do something different, I'm going to get rid of those and we'll just pick the network. And if you pick something like network profit and loss statement, and again it shouldn't be saying network here, it should just be saying profit and loss statement, then that's actually defined internally to be a graph. And so there are only a few of these which do that, and they're usually ones which have lots of results on, where they're only really intended to be shown in a table, not to be shown ever as a picture. And the way the logic works is, even though there is an explicit checkbox in the drawing interface to say whether you want a graph or a table, in fact, if the predefined graph says it should be a table, then actually you will always get a table regardless of how this is set. And we don't attempt to change this according to what you've selected here, because if in general you wanted graphs, you wouldn't really want this to suddenly be set to table just because you temporarily selected profit and loss statement. So basically, regardless of this, if profit and loss statement says it wants to be a table, that's what you're going to get. Actually right now you don't get it because Stuart hasn't finished that bit, but that's how it will work. On an even rarer basis, there are really about 2 or 3 predefined graphs that have a specific predefined format. the resource unit utilization graph is one chart which has a particular squared line stacked format. If the predefined graph specifies its format, then that's what you will get. There is a format tab over here which we haven't looked at yet, and basically, just briefly, if you change the format tab to say anything different to automatic, then what you do here will override what it says in the graph. But that's kind of intuitive, and there are so few graphs that have a predefined format anyway that that's really a very obscure detail which you shouldn't worry about too much. So finally, if I go back to the case we had originally, which is where we were drawing not the network, but we were just drawing a couple of elements, the service and the resource, and we're on the graph tab, and I'm going to be picking something like demanding connections and the resource installed in incremental units. Then at any time, if you suddenly decide that you want to put some other results in which aren't in the predefined graphs, or you want to change one of the predefined graphs for this particular case, at any time you can go down here into the bottom right hand corner where it says custom results, and what that will do is it'll take you into the results tab instead of the graphs tab, and I think when it's working correctly it should have actually selected the elements that would have been on the corresponding graphs, although you could have had more than one graph selected, and so it wouldn't exactly map to a particular set of results here, because results here would all be on one graph. Maybe Stuart's intentionally not done it, I'm not sure. And conversely, if you just want to go back from predefined graphs, you can click where it's if you want to go back from all the detailed results here, if you want to go back to predefined graphs, then you can click a similar button here to go back to the graphs tab. When you go back to graphs, we're not going to make any attempt to guess which graph would correspond to an arbitrary selection of results, and so it'll just remember whichever graphs you had selected before. That's all I need to say, and that basically means that you can then choose, in a nutshell, whether you're going to draw from the predefined graphs, or more generally, whether you're going to draw from the full set of results.